how much did the company's prior trial failure, like for example in Rett syndrome, which they called the excellent study, influence this decision? Because when Anavex announced the trial missed its primary endpoints, they immediately blamed like the high placebo response, which we saw, I think, in cassava, and then immediately, try to pivot to ad hoc analysis. Did you see that as like a playbook that they would use for Alzheimer's as well?
Yeah, I'm joking. I think Anthony and I are both racing to answer this. So whenever a company says that there is an unexpected placebo effect, that is basically a synonym for our drug didn't work. Because if you thought the placebo was going to do X and it did better than X, well, you still think you still would have had your drug do better than placebo, right? It's one of the biggest euphemisms, that I can think of. It's the silliest thing in the world. It's like saying I didn't run my marathon, less than 4 minutes because my running speed was less than expected. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I'd say that, like, if you look at enough biotech shorts, you kind of see a lot of the same themes over and over again. So there's nothing like too fancy or like different.
That is definitely the theme.
Anavex.
Placebo did better than we thought. And if you throw out these patients, if you throw out every mile but mile 15, I did really great in mile 15. I put in a world record performance in mile 15. You should give me the medal. You should give me the #1 place for the marathon. That's kind of the craziness. And when you dare say, okay, let's just do just mile 15 with you against Usain Bolt, and you say, I don't want to do that. It's kind of this really hard to understand. Statistics are one of these things that the human brain is just terrible at. If you ask any sort of general question about statistics, it's very hard to intuit it. And I think this is the thing that traps almost everyone we see from the retail world, and even the non-retail world, especially non-biotech funds. They'll sometimes make some money and they'll just take a lark on like an immune. We saw somebody do that. We saw that with cassava, and they're just like, I don't want to study statistics. I don't want, and we saw people just like misunderstand what even a p-value is. And it really doesn't take more than 3 hours of studying before you pretty much can get a good handle on what like a type 1 error is, or type 2 error is, and error, and the null hypothesis, even more advanced concepts. So just spend an hour or two on that. And I think that, again, how much people want to run away from confirmation or disconfirmation. It's one of the scariest things in human psychology is like, I really don't want to be proven wrong. I will go to the grave before somebody proves me wrong. And the best traders, really, one of the things Kramer taught me when I was 16, watching him trade, was, the most important skill is changing your mind upon new information. And it's something that humans have the hardest time on. They just won't change their mind. And if you look at it in Trump and politics in general, forget Trump, when you hear a bad thing about a politician or a good thing about a politician, rarely does it change your mind. You'll take the good thing. But if something bad happens about your politician that is palpably bad, you just dig in and you say, it's all lies, it's a conspiracy. And sometimes it is, I'm sure. But that sort of approach is kind of what happens in biotech, where if you show somebody some data or some statistics, they just really cower in fear because they assume the worst. They assume that you're after their money. They assume that there's this really nefarious, thing that you're doing. And in reality, it's just like, hey, like I said, I know poker and you don't know poker. You're sitting down at a big poker table with a bunch of poker pros. They all have grins on their face. And I have the courtesy to tell you, hey man, you're at the wrong table and you don't know poker, and 2 and 7 is not a good hand in poker. And you have the audacity to say, no, you're wrong. And meanwhile, every other poker pro, that all the healthcare hedge funds, for example, every other poker pro doesn't dare say a word, because why would they? Why would they tip you off? If you want to throw all away your money at the 5,100 no limit table, they're going to let you. And I'm going to let you too. But I'm at least going to sort of be like, hey man, are you sure you're in the right place? And if you've ever been in Vegas and you've had this experience, as you can tell I've had, the nicer poker guys tell you, hey, maybe you want to sit at a lower stakes table. I don't know. It seems like you're going to throw away all your money, or they'll at least sort of give you some body language that maybe you're in the wrong place. And I think that's a nice thing to do. We don't always do it, but I think for the most obvious ones, it's pretty I don't know. That's my perspective. Like I said, Anthony has a unique and interesting viewpoint on that. But yeah, it's not uncommon for tells you that they're probably going to do it here. But there's also the reason we're short now instead of last year when all this happened, or 2 years ago, or this study is so old, which is another red flag, is because like this is it. This is the end of the road. You know, biotechs have a really weird ability to make sure that they get paid, there's severances attached. Like I'm sure if Chris leaves Anavex, his severance is like 2 or 3 million cash. You know, does that sound fair to you for presiding over this disgusting drug development thing? 800K a year in salary, stock, bonuses, perks, you name it, and all for a big failure. It's really not fair from my perspective, but regardless, the incentive structure is there, and we're now at the end. This is the final card. This is the river. We will know tomorrow, or at latest the 12th of December, whether or not he won the hand. And it is so obvious to anybody breathing that he didn't win the hand. But if he tries to lie and sneak around it, you know, I wouldn't be that surprised, but I don't think it's going to work. People have seen the writing on the walls.
Just to follow up on the compensation structure, I think it would be really nice to see biotech's compensation structure be similar to what Elon is doing at Tesla, right? Unless your drug works, you don't get paid. I mean, it's probably never going to happen, but yeah, just throwing some ideas there.
I have that with my drug company Retrofin, which is still public. It's called 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗍 now, and I had a 200K salary. And I debated with my shareholders of going to zero salary just to show my alignment. I had 20% of the shares outstanding, but I got replaced by basically people that, you know, did the Christopher Missling thing. You know, let me get as much stock as possible. Let me take the least amount of risk possible. Let me get the most amount of cash possible. Forget stock. Cash was the king. And, you know, just coast. And that's the biotech playbook, because one of the scariest things I've learned in my career is many people are very happy with $5 million. And they don't see the difference between 5 and 500. They even don't believe that they can get to 50 or 500, and they will do anything to grab the 5 and put it in their pocket and make sure it's in their pocket and secure it. And who cares about everybody else? Who cares about the shareholders? Who cares about my colleagues? Who cares about the patients? Let me just secure my 5 million because I've never thought I'd have 5 million, and that's that. But the people like Elon, dare I say myself, Anthony, other people who are confident that they have great skills, they're confident they can create value, they don't want cash because they know cash is easy to get. What's hard to get is stock in a company that's worth billions. That's hard to get. And if you can get that, you can make a fortune. And if you have skills, you believe you can do that. And I think cash comp is one of the biggest alpha signs there is. In fact, Robinhood recently put out a compensation structure for Vlad, who's I think one of the best CEOs, that, you know, if he achieved certain outcomes, he'd get, you know, really high outcomes, he'd get really high amount of stock. And look, that's the kind of thing that's going to drive somebody, whereas the average pharma executive has no interest in doing any of that. It's a very cushy job. So anyway, we have another question maybe.
So on the scores that measure the outcome of the drug, when I compare the drug against the placebo, I don't see any difference. At least I'm looking at the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's, where they published the data from the study.
Yeah.
It looks like on the CDR-SB score, placebo had a mean change of 1.7 points, whilst the 50 milligram dose has a 1.2. I mean, what is the difference here? Like, I don't see any use of the drug. Is this how can they go forward with this such a insignificant difference?
So, I mean, you know, the thing about this particular trial, like many Alzheimer's trials, is that they tried to do many different points of evaluation. So they did ADAS-Cog, they did ADCS-ADL, they did CDR-SB, they did CGI-I. So they do a lot of different analyses. And, you know, the thing is, though, this particular study, well, in all studies, you always have to predefine like what you're going to be looking at. You have to pre-specify your endpoints. And so they decided to choose ADAS-Cog and ADCS-ADL, and then like afterwards, when they realized that they failed on the second endpoint, they decided to try to change it. And they're like, well, you know, CDR-SB is just as good, and actually we meant to use this one instead. And so the difference is actually statistically significant for CDR-SB. It's a smaller scale than ADAS-Cog. ADAS-Cog is a bit of a bigger like scale, like a more dynamic range to it than CDR-SB. But those two tests were stat sig. But again, critically, like they just threw out a bunch of patients. Like they didn't define like what ITT meant. Like they didn't define like why they removed 40 patients out of the analysis cohort. And so that's really what it comes down to, is that they didn't ever show any like meaningful difference between placebo and drug arm if you consider like the whole entirety of the patient population. Like we said, like we know the EMA is going to ask that question. In fact, we know that they've asked that question because like when you submit your package to the EMA, they come back to you and ask you questions. Like they have like a list of questions. That's literally what it is. It's a list of questions that they send to you, and then you have a chance to respond, and then you can respond, and then they can come back to you and say there's still a list of outstanding issues, and this is what they sent to them in September. And now this week, what happened is the EMA actually graced them with the opportunity. They graced them with a chance to give an oral explanation. Explain yourself orally before us, and to explain why you've thrown out all of these patients, why you've done this kind of analysis, and that oral explanation happened on Tuesday, and I can't imagine it went well, because at the end of the day, like, how could it?
But would you say that from all of these scores, there was a score that was more significant towards drug approval?
I mean, yeah, like, well, if you look at the analysis that they present, like they present an analysis, and 2 of those tests hit stat sig, and they say that this is enough to gain approval. On its face, like that's a reasonable argument, but the problem again is that you have removed so many patients that it's a worthless result. It's completely spurious. If you take into consideration the entire patient cohort that was actually given the drug, which the EMA will, because that's in their guidelines, and that's explicitly what any reasonable clinical trial evaluator would do. If you do that, then the difference shrinks, and there is no difference between placebo and drug, and therefore, this is basically a horrible drug, and it won't get approved.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to add that like multiple comparisons is kind of one of the other devils of statistical analysis. That if you try to compare many different tests, you may eventually get one by accident. And while I don't think that's exactly what happened here, it's just something to watch out for. I do think the main, kind of red flag or bombshell here is the ITT redefinition of the throwing out of patients not at random. I think they threw out patients who biased the study, and the tipping point analysis tells us that. But always looking out for pre-specified endpoints without doing multiple comparisons. There are ways to adjust multiple comparisons. I gave a talk at Harvard about this, and it was, it was actually sponsored by a statistics professor, which I didn't know going into it. So he was very happy when I showed the error correction methods that you can use. And it's just sort of one of these things that, again, does not make sense to human psychology. It is one of the hardest sort of things to understand intuitively. Once you spend enough time on it, you get it and you accept it. But there's sort of this part of you that always says, well, no, the cancer drug works. It's just that you have to look at it this way. And, the ones that have done this for so long will smile and say, okay, you have to learn your lesson the hard way. And this is going to be yet again one of those times. What sucks is that people will stop investing in biotech after they do this, because they just throw up their hands and say, oh, it was too hard. But they were just as sure of themselves going into it, then they're just as sure that they can't get there afterwards. And it's just, it sucks to see the same thing over and over and over and over again. Swisher, maybe?
How likely is it possible that they threw out like patients that were non-responders?
Yeah, pretty likely.
Yeah, it's hard to say what happened here, and that's why the CSR is the gold standard. When you pay a CRO, an outside third-party company, to do a clinical trial, they come back to you with a CSR. The CSR is what the SEC and FBI are going to be getting in a situation like this, and they're going to look at the CSR and say, well, according to the CRO, who doesn't want to go to jail, the CRO said that this was your p-value. And you all of a sudden did, these changes to redefine everything so that you thought this was your p-value. Because you knew that if you did the real p-value, you wouldn't have gotten anywhere. Your stock would have gone down, and instead you were able to pay yourself salary, stock, and all these things. And I think that, you know, the CSR is really what you're paying for. It's the final report of the clinical trial that you commissioned, and it's usually 100, 150 pages, and you know, you really can't redefine or fuck with it. And again, I would love to see a redacted CSR here or from other companies in the industry, but I don't think we're ever going to get there. Sometimes the only visibility we get, as we saw with 𝗕𝗢𝗢, was the FDA telling you that actually, no, you didn't do it the right way.
They're pretty clear.
Thank you.
Yeah, Noam, did you want to jump in, or somebody else?
Yeah, if I can jump in, that would be great. I just had a quick question about how you're actually doing the trade. I'm assuming you're not really using any options. You're just naked shorting it, just because the option premiums are so expensive. But what would you say the potential downside is if, I mean, it sounds like it's almost impossible that the drug would actually succeed. But if it does, what would be the potential downside, and how high could the stock possibly go?
Yeah, two good questions. The first is that, you know, I do options on binary events. I try not to trade options in general, but with binary events, you have pretty good reasons to do them. So I think the Novembers are in play. You know, the Decembers are like 99% chance it's in play. But you know, it's one of these things where, you know, caveat emptor. You know, you're on your own. Don't blame me if something goes wrong. I'm just telling you, I think the stock's going to cash value. Cash value here is probably around $1. They have been burning money, as all productless biotech companies do. They've been burning cash. And so when we get their latest cash figures, we should see 75 cents a share-ish of cash in my estimation. And that's usually where companies that have like given up all hope and never, you know, are doing strategic alternatives will go. Some companies will sometimes try to play the game that, oh no, actually, you know, we're fine. This is nothing. Nothing's wrong. You know, we'll be fine. The market's going to see through that pretty clearly. But I do think, you know, they're going to try to get re-examined. They're going to try to, if they can kick this can down the road to next year, they will. But the reality is, I do think the jig is up. Now, if they somehow did get a EMA approval, well, you know, I certainly think that the doctors won't pay for it, or the countries won't pay for it, and the doctors won't prescribe it. But, you know, it obviously would be good news, and I could see the stock double on that, maybe go to 12. Anything to add or subtract, Anthony?
I mean, yeah, there's certainly, you know, in any binary on a biotech, you know, going to be, you know, risk of getting it wrong. But that's why we do what we do. We bet pretty consistently on absolute 100% sure things, and you know, it would take something absolutely miraculous, truly, like Jesus himself is back on earth, before I see Anavex get approved from the EMA. So
Yeah, and I second that.
Okay, interesting. That's super interesting. I appreciate the explanation. So I'm assuming you're just naked shorting it just because the options premiums are so expensive. You're effectively paying half.
It sounds like that's your opinion. I am long all the puts in November and December.
Oh, you are? Okay, so
And I'm short the stock.
Okay, interesting. So what would be the calculation on the long the puts? Because if I go based off of memory, for the puts, it's what, $2.50 per $5 put. So at that point, what you make, if it gets to your $1.25 estimation per share, you're not really making that big of a percentage compared to the money that you're fronting, really, are you? Like, what am I missing there?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that the 5 puts would go to $4 a put. Yesterday, they were more like $2. So $2 to $4 is a good return in my book.
How do you actually weigh up, in terms of the calculation, how you split it up between shorts and puts? Is it basically just to sort of spread risk?
Just 2 seconds. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there. I mean, I think the experience guides you a little bit. You want to do a simulation of every stock price outcome and ask yourself, are you happy with the P&L at every possibility from 1 to 100? And if the answer is yes, that's the trade you want. If the answer is no, change the trade until you have the payout graph that you want. All right, let's go, Ipo.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your time and the opportunity. I'm not going to go deep into the company because I don't have the same amount of knowledge as you guys, obviously. I just want to ask Martin, what's the level of confidence if we compare the trade to cassava, immune, and Atir?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we try to only do, I mean, if you're going to put your neck out in public and risk being wrong, that's something we don't want to do lightly. And especially with this like super high conviction prediction that a bad thing will happen to a drug company that's going to send its stock down a lot. This is not just a trade, right? Like this is like something we do a few times a year. This year, I think we've done 2. So this would be the 3rd for this year. And that's quite frankly above average. In my career, there's sometimes, generally on average about 2 a year that I do. Sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 0. So this is a little above average with 3, but I think that, you don't want to be gambling in biotech. And with the FDA, as we've seen recently, like with Unicure, with Replimune, like you never know, there's no real rhyme or reason sometimes to, oh, I thought that trial would work, it didn't work. I thought that trial wouldn't work, it did work. We try to stick to that level of conviction. So I can't really tease apart like, is this worse or better than this or that? Because they're all sort of the same. They're all a little bit of a different movie in the same genre, but they're all sort of the same movie in some ways. I don't know if you want to add anything, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, we're quite sure. That's what I would say. I mean, we know that. I mean, at the end of the day, like if you just read the evidence that they put out, it is definitely low quality evidence, like low level of certainty that this drug works is what anyone would have to say when they look at it. And we know that because like they, there are whenever anyone writes anything in this field, right? You decide how much burden you want to take on, right? Like you can sit there and you can take on a lot of burden, and you can have a very well-run trial that answers a lot of questions very faithfully, or you can run a low-burden trial, and you can put out results that are quite easily challenged by even basic questions like like the first one was like intention to treat or not. And like if you can't answer those kinds of very very basic questions convincingly, like with your paper and with your data, like you've just, it's almost assured that like you failed. And because like why would you why would you take a low burden data like presentation, like why would you show a low burden result when you could have a high burden result and like definitely get approval and definitely convince everyone, and like definitely, because like this isn't just about the inexperienced person like looking at their data. It's about like doctors, like professional regulators, like true professionals in this field, like are going to ask like really hard questions, like really intense questions. And so if you can't answer those, like you just have no shot, and they can't. And that's kind of where it is. Like I look at the data that they've shown. I've shown how they play their hands. Like they show great weakness, as my grandfather would say. So.
And just a small follow-up, if I have the opportunity. Can you explain a little bit briefly why they didn't go to the FDA for the drug? Is it because they don't trust it, or do they have a problem with the FDA? Just briefly, if you have the time. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't put words in their mouth, but I would just say that it. I mean, a couple of things. Like one, they did like their entire clinical trial was run outside of the United States, so they never intended to go to the FDA, in my opinion. But two, like the FDA, I think the process is done and over quite quickly. I think with the EMA, they can kind of kick the can down the road a lot more, but I really can't tell you exactly why.
Yeah, I can add to this. I mean, as somebody who's run publicly traded drug companies and privately traded ones, if you have a good drug, whatever the circumstance may be, we see this sometimes with Chinese trials, you go and do an FDA, US clinical trial for FDA approval. All the money's here, right? Like you can sell $5 billion of a good Alzheimer's drug. So if you thought your drug worked, independent of whether if you had the confidence that a drug worked, like you said, oh, I love my asset, I know this drug works. The first thing you would do is go do a clinical trial. Now, trials aren't cheap. But this company could raise $100 million. They could go ahead and tell the world, we're going to do this for the FDA because you should be excited. This is going to be a blockbuster, and it probably would make their stock go up. To be frank, but they didn't even have the confidence to do that. I mean, if you're the CEO of this company, why wouldn't you, go do that phase 3? You're basically telling the world, I don't believe in my drug that much because this $100 million phase 3 is, I have other things to spend money on. It's like, well, what? Do the trial. And I think that, it speaks volumes. Without doing there are trials that, have that situation where they did not include a US site for whatever reason. Again, this happens in China every day. Summit has this situation, and they're doing 10, new phase 3s in the US because they believe the drug works. Now, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but if you don't believe as a CEO that your drug works, what are you doing? Why are you filing in Europe? Does it work in Europe and not in the US? Is there something special about French DNA that this drug will only work for Alzheimer's disease patients in Europe? I mean, it makes no sense. So I think that speaks volumes. And then